Okay, today I'm going to be preaching on spiritual discernment. And I'm kind of interested on what you guys think. What I mean by that is, who here is interested in having spiritual discernment? Who here, as we walk with God, want to be able to know and understand when it's God speaking, when it's God asking you to move, right? I'm asking that rhetorically because I know that this is a very important topic. When we look at our walk with God, when we look at, what we have to learn and the challenges that we go through and so many of the things that come up, spiritual discernment really becomes something that helps us get through that successfully, where we can actually know what God is saying. We can know what God is doing. We don't have to guess, right? And I think that happens a lot when we kind of get into that. So I'm going to talk about spiritual discernment today, but it'll probably be in a way that you're not expecting, because it really is much simpler than we think. We make it more difficult than it has to be, and that's because we're trying to figure it out, and that makes it complicated. And it's not about that. God is not sitting there wanting you to figure out the equation or the algorithm or the combination or whatever you want to put in front of that in order to figure out what he's doing and where he's going and what he's saying. It shouldn't be complicated, but it becomes very complicated. As we learn to walk with God, it can be very challenging to recognize, okay, is this God telling me to do this? Is this new opportunity from God? Is this door closing from God? Or is it an attack from the enemy, right? This is all spiritual discernment, where we start to figure out who's talking and who are we following. This is all spiritual discernment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But before I get into the actual discernment part, I think that we all have to realize, to get to a place where you can have spiritual discernment, where you recognize something in front of you and you know the difference of what it is. In other words, if it's from God or not, you have to first learn sound spiritual judgment. Now, when I say sound spiritual judgment, I'm not talking about judging others. I'm not talking about going to somebody else and judging them for what they are doing. When I'm talking about sound spiritual judgment, that means that we are making sound and what. He had some surgery. I thought there was something wrong with that. That's okay. Sound judgment means you make wise spiritual decisions. It's no different than sound judgment in life, right? If I were to say, here's a problem, and you're 18, how would you deal with that problem? How would you work through making a decision for that problem? And compare that to where you're at now in your life. And what's the difference? You've probably learned along the way through experiences, through mistakes, through failures, through successes, sound judgment. And these are things that we learn over time, where we learn how to make good, solid decisions. And we learn what to base our decisions on and what not to base our decisions on. And so again, sometimes we overcomplicate or over-spiritualize our walk with God. And really, in all honesty, to be able to know the difference of who God is and when he's speaking and where he's sending you, you just have to be able to practice that sound spiritual judgment. And spiritual judgment is not something that's difficult. You're able to make wise spiritual decisions when you start doing certain things, right? Through your prayer to God and your meditation on his word. That is going to help build sound spiritual judgment, because you're spending time with Jesus, with the Father. You're learning about him in the Word. Your actual experiences with God are going to contribute to you being able to have sound spiritual judgment. As you encounter things with God, and he tells you to go right, but you went left, or whatever, right? You start to have these experiences with God. You learn sound spiritual judgment. You learn how to make better decisions because of where you've gone through with God. You actually put yourself out there to walk with God. And then, of course, our ability to distinguish between good and evil in the spirit. That's a difficult one. A lot of people get that wrong. Some people are oblivious to that. There's so many Christians that don't even think that that's a real thing. They don't think that there's spiritual influences. Oh, that was for Jesus' day. That's not for our day. And when you really stop and pay attention, it's pretty obvious that there's an enemy of God that is trying to do everything he can to mess things up in God's kingdom. The victory's already won, so we don't have to worry about it. But what I'm trying to point out is that to get to that place where you have that sound judgment, you're spending time with God in prayer, you're meditating on his word, you're gaining experience through walking with God, and you're starting to learn the difference between spiritual good and spiritual evil. These are the things that will bring you to having sound spiritual judgment. And it all has to be based on our relationship with the Father. You can learn how to successfully have this sound spiritual judgment and be able to repeat it over and over and over again as you build a relationship with the Father. And this would show where more often than not, you make the right decision in a situation, spiritually speaking. This is very difficult for people to figure out, where we try to understand where God is leading us or what God is saying, and it can just get muddy for some reason. It can just get messed up, or we just don't really truly know in our heart of hearts, even if we project or say something different. There's just unsureness there. Like, is this really God speaking to me? Is this really God leading me there? But everything I'm talking about always comes back to that relationship with the Father, where the more you get to know God, the more you start to recognize when he moves, when he speaks, when he is doing something, when he is up to something. You start to sense it in the spirit. And over time, it gets easier and easier. You know, you look at some of the people in the Bible who dedicated their life to God, and some of the things that they went through all throughout their life. This is like a lifelong journey. You can't just get saved and then instantly overnight have all this spiritual discernment and wisdom and be able to operate. You may have a gift that gives you the ability to operate in certain ways, but in all fairness, most people have to take time to learn to walk with God. And so I'm trying to point that out this morning, is that we overcomplicate it. We walk into this relationship with God thinking, because we see that person doing it or we hear this person talking about it, that all of a sudden we're just going to be able to get it from our life. And yet we're not putting in the time. We're not praying. We're not worshiping. You can't have it both ways. You either spend time with God and you grow and are built up through that to a place where you get spiritual discernment because of that, or you don't. You can't just expect to obtain things without putting in the work. Now, I'll say that all with the caveat that God can bless people with all kinds of stuff. And you can get spiritual wisdom overnight. You can get blessings. You can get all kinds of stuff. God is no respecter of persons. If you see it in someone else or you read about it in someone else, he can give it to you. But you have to be willing to take that approach to God where you ask the honest question, like, God, where am I at and where do you want me to be? Am I following your word or am I pushing my own agenda? Am I listening to you or am I talking or is my mind too busy where I don't even hear you? Right? There's all these things that we have to evaluate. But if you bring it down to a more simple approach where you just press in, you press in more and more and more. You get that fire in your belly for God, and you just go after him, and you build that relationship. All of a sudden, you'll start to see, you will get impartations spiritually. You will have God do things in your life that you wouldn't have done before because of what you're doing, because of how you're pressing forward. And so, spiritual discernment is something that I don't think most Christians take seriously. And what I mean by that is exactly what I've been saying up until this point, is that we kind of walk into it thinking that we're just going to get it overnight, or we're just going to be able to know, right? And I say that because time and time again, all throughout my life, I've met people and they say they know that God is telling them to do something or go somewhere or be something or whatever. And I'm not here to argue with whatever somebody thinks they hear God saying to them. But when you start to learn spiritual discernment and have good sound spiritual judgment, you can start to perceive and discern things, and you can see that person is way off. I'm not here to judge them, but clearly they're not hearing from God. Like, you just get to a point where, and you can be wrong about that, but I'm just saying that a lot of Christians will just approach things and make decisions and have some sort of discernment, but it's not actual spiritual discernment from God. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize today, is that really to get that true spiritual discernment, it takes effort. And what I mean by effort is putting in the time with God, building that relationship with Him, because the only way you can be able to understand what's happening in front of you and whether or not God is speaking or not is if you know His voice. The only way you're going to know if He's pushing you in a certain direction is if you know who He is. And you got to know, right? Like I've talked about before. Is this a moment where I sit back, I prepare myself for battle, but I do nothing? Or am I supposed to step out in faith and actually put myself out there? Because there is a difference. And it's the discernment in the Spirit where all of a sudden you get to know the difference. And you get to understand, oh, this is that moment when God wants me to step out. You know, time and time again, I've had job opportunities. But which one of those job opportunities was the one that God wanted me to step out into? I could have applied for them all. Maybe I got them, maybe I didn't. But instead of banging my head against the brick wall or be like a clanging cymbal over and over and over again, maybe I should stop and press into God and just let Him show me. And just let Him start downloading this spiritual peace. And that is what really differentiates when you have spiritual discernment, is you come to a place of peace. You come to a place of rest. You don't have to worry about if it's God speaking to me or not, because I know the difference when God is speaking. I don't have to worry about if God is leading me or telling me to move or not, because I know that He's going to confirm it, and He's going to make everything work out for my good. Like, you just start getting to this place where walking with God becomes a much more simple process. Because instead of, like I said, trying to figure everything out and know all the answers, you just instead start walking with the Father. You're holding His hand in love and just saying, let's go, God. Take me wherever you want to take me today. Speak through me, whatever you want to speak through me today. It becomes so much more simple. So again, getting to a place of spiritual discernment, you really have to learn how to have sound spiritual judgment. And as I stated before, that comes through thorough prayer with God. All day long I pray to God. All day long. Every single day of my life. Not of my life, but for the last however many years. My whole day is consumed with thinking about and praying and dwelling on God. I may be in the middle of a meeting at work, tense, and I'm thinking about God. I may be outside gardening, and I'm thinking about God. Why? It's because He ignited something inside of me where all I can think about is wanting to be with Him. Because I've actually tasted and seen His Spirit, His goodness, His love. And when you truly encounter the God of heaven, the God of the Bible, you will be captivated in a way where you can't help but want more of things. You can't help but want to press in even more. And with that comes certain things. And sound spiritual judgment is one of those things. As you press in prayer, as you meditate on God's Word, you learn about who He is as a person, and you build yourself up as a man or woman of God, all of a sudden, things start changing. Again, think about when you were a baby Christian compared to now. How do you approach when someone says they're sick? How do you approach when somebody says, I have a problem? How do you approach when doom and gloom is looming over your life? Are you worried, or are you at rest and in peace because of who you're walking with? Right? It's a total difference that happens over time. So we have to make sure that we take that time every single day to have that thorough prayer life. Speak to God, press into His Spirit, read His Word, even if it's just one little thing, one little part of the Bible. Read His Word, because He's going to speak to you through it. You're going to get to know Him through it. He's going to teach you through it. Paying attention to God as we walk through life, building the experiences that we have, right? That's going to help you to have better judgment. And of course, being able to distinguish between good and evil in the Spirit. So, how many here have ever been on the road driving? For those of you that drive. And let's say you're on a freeway, right? And you're driving, you're paying attention, everything's good. And then within milliseconds, you notice something on the road. And in your brain or your emotional heart or whatever, some sort of warning is happening inside. Right? You're driving on the freeway, you notice something, and instantly you know, uh-oh, what is that on the road? Why are people swerving? What am I seeing, right? Like you're in a moment where something is before you on the road, and you are perceiving that it's different than normal. And something inside of you is throwing a red flag, warning, 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 swerve, 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 whatever, right? Like we've all been there, and I use that as an example because it's quick. And you don't have time to think about it, it's in your own way. You have to what? React. So on the road, when you have milliseconds, you don't have time to be like, well, that kind of looks like a duck, but I'm not sure. If I run over a duck, it's not going to hurt anything. But if it's a, big piece of metal or a cap or something like that, yeah, that's going to be a problem for you, your car, and probably everybody behind you. Right? You don't have time to think. You react because what? Your eyes are perceiving something. You're perceiving something in front of you, and it feels and looks different. And you may not even know what it is yet, but honestly, it doesn't matter in that moment. Because inside you, you're already having a reaction. So you've now perceived something, you're starting to react to it. And if you have what? Experience driving, you're going to know what to do. If you're a brand new 18-year-old driver, you might freak out, swerve off the road, slam on the brakes when you don't need to, right? But through experience, you learn kind of what to do as you start to see these obstructions or dangers on the road. And I use this as an example because this is a great example of what it should look like in the Spirit. To perceive is through the eyes. When you perceive something, that's typically through the eyes. When you discern something, it's just through other senses. That's all it needs. Right? So if I put my finger in water, I'm going to discern that the environment around my finger just changed. And it's now wet. It's not in dry air because I've discerned through my sense of touch that something is different. And if it's warm water and I'm sleeping, that's a problem. Right? Okay. So we discern with other things. We perceive with our eyes, but we discern with our other senses. And that's where the spirit man comes into play. That's where the spirit within you, God gave you your flesh, your soul, which is your mind, will, and emotions, and your spirit. Your spirit will discern. It will start to recognize things that are going on around you that you cannot see. If I feel the wind, just because I don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. It's no different in the spirit. When I start to notice things in the spirit, well, I got to be able to understand what it is that I'm noticing. Did anybody ever have any kind of like science experiments in school where they make you smell something but you can't see it? Or they make you feel something and you can't see it, right? Where you start to like have to use your senses, and sometimes it's kind of like, whoa, or ill, or whatever, right? Like they're doing something to you on purpose to kind of get you going with your senses, and you don't understand because you can't see it. And you might think it's one thing, and then you actually get to see it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I was totally off. I was totally off to what that actually was. And the thing I was comfortable with is actually the thing that's gross and disgusting. Whatever, right? The whole point of things like that is to help us understand that sometimes our senses can throw us off. Sometimes we can't trust our senses. And a lot of that is based on either perception or a lack of perception or untrained senses. When you start to train up your senses, now all of a sudden I can better regulate how I react to those senses. And so this idea of discernment Think of it like what I was describing on the road. That was perception. In the Spirit, you should start building yourself up in your relationship with God where it's no different. Where when the enemy comes, those red flags start kicking off inside you. And you know this is not of God. I don't accept cancer. That's not of God. Right? Like certain things will come out of you as you gain the strength and experience in discernment. And it's through your spirit. It's like perception, but it's different because it's not through your eyes. And the only way we can truly be spiritually discerning is if we're connected to God. Period. If you are connected to God, you can be spiritually discerning to when He's speaking to you, and when He's telling you to go, and when He's telling you to stay, or whatever. People have a gift in the Spirit, and they can be spiritually discerning, but they can use that for evil purposes. Right? You see that with like tarot card reading, psychic people. They have a gift in the Spirit where they can see and hear and sense certain things spiritually that we cannot. But if they're not connected to God, they're not going to know when God is speaking. If they don't know who God is or recognize His voice, they're not going to be able to tell if it's actually Him speaking. That's why I keep emphasizing, as a Christian, as a believer, as somebody who follows Jesus, if you don't have that connection with God, you're not going to be able to recognize His voice. And so when you're facing that situation where you're wondering, is this of God? Should I do this? Should I go there? Whatever the case may be, if you don't know the Father's voice, if you don't know who He is, you're going to have trouble knowing the difference. So the more we press in, the more we worship, the more we set ourselves apart for Him, the stronger our spirit becomes. As we connect to Him in the Spirit, our spirit man is bolstered up. That's why fasting works so well, because it starts to diminish your flesh, and your spirit has no other choice but to be strengthened towards God. You start pressing in. You're replacing your food with worship or reading the Word or whatever, and your spirit man grows. It's the same thing. It's like it's getting plugged into a wall, and it lights up with power. When your spirit man starts to grow in God, that's exactly what's happening. Is it becomes alive and strengthened in a way that it wasn't before, through that connection with God. And it's through that spirit that we're able to have that discernment. As our spirit man grows stronger, we're able to start having spiritual discernment, where we can, I'll say, perceive, right, or discern something in front of us and be able to know the difference of what it is or who's talking. And so, if our spirit is what is there to create a better connection with God in order to have spiritual discernment, well, then we can't forget about the other two, our flesh and our soul. And that means that if one can impact it, then the other two can impact it. So your flesh and your soul can impact your ability to spiritually discern. So even if you're pressing in, even if you're praying, even if you're doing all the right things, but you're not fixing something inside of you, or changing inside of you, or getting generational curses healed, or whatever, there are things within you that can throw this whole thing off if you're not paying attention to it, right? You could be the most on-fire Christian that I've ever met. You could read the Word more than anybody I've ever met. You could pray more than anybody I've ever met. But if your emotions are out of control, and you lose it, and you go off the handle every time something happens that you don't like or whatever, you really think you're going to be successful in God? Probably not, because your soul and your flesh are getting in the way of your ability to start hearing God, to start discerning in the Spirit, right? They're interfering. And so we have to be aware that this circle of life between our flesh and our spirit and our soul, there are certain areas where they are all connected. We have to be aware of it. This is one of those things. If we want to have spiritual discernment, again, like I said when I started, I want to be able to walk into a situation where I know what God is telling me to do. And I know when He's telling me to go, or when He's telling me to stay, or if He's telling me to go after this job, or if He's telling me to marry this person, or whatever the case may be. If I want to be able to get to that place, these are the things I have to be aware of and start to master. So our emotion, our desires, or maybe our poor judgment, right? Allowing people to get too close, trusting people when we shouldn't, being close to people that maybe we shouldn't, right? That's bad judgment, where you're not practicing good, sound judgment, right? All those things in your emotions and your desire, they can all cause us to think we have discerned something when really we haven't. I've been there before in my life where I think I've heard from God, but really it's my emotions, or it's something within me that is causing me to be pushed in that direction, and it's not really God. Like, He has nothing to do with it. But I'm thinking I'm having spiritual discernment, and the next thing I know, I make a mistake because I'm basing it off of my emotions or my flesh instead of my spirit man, because maybe I don't understand the difference, or maybe I've allowed those other two to get in the way and I don't realize it. And that's what I'm trying to point out, is that we have to be really, really careful with that. There's a really great story in the scriptures on a topic like this, where a person lets their flesh and their emotions get in the way of their spiritual discernment. And thank God that He is graceful and merciful and patient with us. Right? And it's in Psalm 73. And I'm not going to read the scriptures in Psalm 73. I would encourage you to write that down and just read that passage. And it's actually a psalm written by Asaph, not David. But it's interesting because the story it talks about this topic where our soul and our flesh are impacting our discernment, and a relationship with God corrects it. So at first in Psalm 73, we see that Asaph seems to struggle with a deep internal conflict. He's got something going on inside him that's tearing him up. And what we find out is that he affirms that God is good to the pure in heart. But he admits that he almost loses his moral footing. The footing that he stands upon in order to do right and wrong, right? Where he is allowing his emotions to get involved. In other words, something is happening in his life that is shaking him, that is causing an internal conflict. And so what? It says it in the scriptures. He was envious of the wicked, who seemed to thrive without consequence. In the story of Psalm 73, we hear him talking about the wicked, the people who sin, the ones who are not following God. They seem to thrive, no matter what, without any consequence. And that's upsetting him. That's causing an internal conflict within him because he's envious, right? He's putting in all the work, and they're not, and they're being successful. So what is happening? That internal conflict is his flesh and his emotions getting in the way. It's now disrupting his internal balance. These people who live in sin lived in ease. They flaunted their pride, and they even mocked God, according to the psalm. Yet they prospered. And this was hard for him to accept. So this apparent injustice led Asaph to question the value of living righteously. Why would I want to live righteously when I could go live like that and just prosper? So here we see an internal conflict. And we've all been there, where there's some big question in our heart that's coming up, and we're wondering about it. And maybe you've even had this happen in your heart. But here he is, he's having this internal struggle. And he feels that his own efforts toward purity were basically in vain, especially in light of his constant suffering. He is trying to walk in righteousness and is suffering because of it. And everyone else that he's looking at is doing whatever they want, and they're prospering. It seems backwards, so that's causing something within me. And that emotional change, that envy that I'm feeling, that confusion, whatever, is definitely causing me to have flawed discernment. That's going to cause you to have flawed discernment in that moment. If you're trying to hear from God, if you're trying to follow God, but you're struggling with something like that, you got to get to the root cause of that problem before you can decide to have that clear spiritual discernment. And that's exactly what happened with him, right? There's a turning point in the story where Asaph has the realization as he enters the sanctuary of God. And in that place, right, this is a depiction, a picture of relationship, where he's now connecting with God. As he connects with God in the sanctuary, he receives a divine perspective. And that is that the prosperity of the wicked is fleeting. In other words, their destruction is going to be sudden and complete. And that's exactly where they're headed. Whether they're receiving prosperity or not, that's the direction that they're going. And he receives this insight as he connects with God. He runs to God, he connects with God, and now all of a sudden his perspective is changing. Why? Because now all of a sudden his flesh and his emotions are diminishing, and his spirit man is growing. And he's in this relationship with God, and he's experiencing this encounter with God where God is opening his eyes to see. Don't look at it like that. You're looking at it in the wrong way. They may be prospering on the edge of a cliff, and they're about to fall off. But you are walking in righteousness, and you're not. You're not anywhere near that, even if it means you're suffering. And so, through this encounter with God, this insight that he receives from the Holy Spirit, it changes his understanding. He has like a shift that occurs within him, right? It was an internal conflict, and now all of a sudden he shifts. He recognizes how foolish and ignorant his earlier thoughts were. That's his first reaction, is to realize, wow, that was pretty dumb of me. How ignorant I was to sit there and think that way about people living in sin and prospering. Like, he's being hard on himself, but we've all been there where we struggle with something in our walk with God. It doesn't make sense, it's not fair, or whatever, but we have to come to the same realization through that connection with God. And so he feels this way, right? And he compares himself and his ignorance and his foolishness to being like those of a beast lacking wisdom. In other words, it's like, I'm acting like a monkey here, an animal, who has no understanding or spiritual discernment or ability to connect with God. I'm just reacting to what's in front of me. He's recognizing he let his flesh and his emotions take over in that moment. And I think this is a great part of the story because I know I've experienced this in my life, and maybe you have too, but when God reveals himself to us in all his glory and his beauty and his wisdom, it has a way of highlighting our barbaric ignorance, making us feel really small. Like, wow. If I had just trusted you, God, why did I get like that? Why did I feel so uneasy? Why did I whatever, right? And we get to see the story in Psalm 73 where Asaph is going through that. So in the end, Asaph finds peace in the presence of God. Despite his doubts and emotional turmoil, everything that was happening within him, he then realizes that God has always been with him. The whole time God was with him. As he was walking in righteousness and quote-unquote suffering, God was right there with him. And he realizes that. He realizes that God was actually guiding him the whole time. And will ultimately receive Asaph into glory. This is almost like a song, like a poetry, like the way he's writing. He's going through this process where he's having this emotional struggle, and then it was his time with God that got him to realize, what was I worried about? Why would I act so dumb like that? You're right there with me, God. Why would I be so confused? And so Asaph's realization is profound. And it is that true security and fulfillment are not found in worldly success, but in a faithful relationship with God. And so there's another scripture that's connected to Psalm 73. And it's Psalms 92, verses 4 through 6. And I'm going to read this out of the New King James Version. 92, verses 4 through 6. For you, Lord, have made me glad through your work. I will triumph in the works of your hands. O Lord, how great are your works. Your thoughts are very deep. A senseless man does not know, nor does a fool understand this. That last sentence, verse 6, that's the part that I want to highlight. And I really like the way it's written in the Passion Translation. In 92:6 Passion Translation, it says, such amazing mysteries are found within every miracle that nearly everyone seems to miss. Those with no discernment can never really discover the deep and glorious secrets hidden in your ways. It's amazing. That's exactly what happened with Asaph in that story. He didn't have discernment in that moment because his flesh and emotions took over. And so he didn't get to see those deep and glorious secrets that were right in front of him. That wonderful beauty of God that was all around him. He should have been standing in peace and security. When everything seemed like it was going left, even though he knew the will of God was to the right, he shouldn't have allowed himself to continue focusing on the left. He should have continued to focus on God, which is, this is the direction God is going. I'm not going to let circumstance or people or the world or culture or anything pull me in a different direction, because I find peace in my relationship with God, in pressing in with God. And through that, I'm able to gain discernment into those deep and glorious secrets that are hidden in God's ways. Those amazing mysteries that are found in all the miracles. So, you might think at some point in my sermon, I'm going to lay out the 5 steps to spiritual discernment. Just follow these 5 steps, and all your problems go away. That's not how this works. Unfortunately, there are no 5 steps to gain spiritual discernment. Because this concept of spiritual discernment, again, it all comes back to relationship and one other thing: faith. You have to have a relationship with God. If you don't, you're never going to recognize His voice. And you have to be willing to move in faith. Because time and time again, you will, I promise you, you will face situations that seem exactly like what I was just talking about. Where everything seems to be going the wrong direction, but in this small, quiet place in your heart, you feel like it's okay, and you're supposed to go a different direction. Even though everything might be feeling like it's going one way, you feel like a whole. And it's your choice in that moment to either believe or not, to trust or not. So you can't have spiritual discernment if you're not going to believe and trust in what you just heard, or where you feel called to go, or what you feel called to do. So you have this relationship with God, but if you don't actually believe and trust in God, that is having faith, then it's going to mean nothing. So you have to have this relationship with God where you press in. And I talked about it earlier. All those things start giving you that sound spiritual judgment, where you can start making better, educated, spiritual decisions. But every single move you make will have to be based in faith. Because you will cross a bridge that makes no earthly sense to you whatsoever. And that's why it's called spiritual discernment. If it was earthly discernment, this would be a totally different conversation. I'd be talking about things that you can learn in school. I'd be talking about worldly wisdom, some of which is good for us to learn so that we can live better, more educated lives, so we can be better citizens to contribute to our communities. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the spiritual, which does not make any earthly sense a lot of times. When you follow God, you're going to be required to have faith, because He will call you to do something that seems out of this world or seems way off, right? I want you to walk away from your family. Wait, what? Why would you say that? Why would you say I need to walk away from my family? That makes no earthly sense. They're my family. Why would I do that? Why would I cut off relationships with people that I love? But yet, God might be saying that because He sees there's something that is on top of you spiritually. And you'll never be able to reach the place He sees you at. He sees you reaching unless you get out from under that spiritual thing that your family has around you and you don't even realize. So He might separate you for a time so that you can now all of a sudden grow. And you can start ascending to this place that He sees you. That's just a small example. That makes no earthly sense. No earthly sense for us to do that, but yet He might call you to do that. There's so many examples I could give you where He might call you to do something, and within you you're like, what? Have you guys talked about this up in heaven? Like, this makes no sense to me at all. And that's where the faith comes in. That's what I'm talking about. The faith comes in when God starts speaking. You have to have faith, because His thoughts are high. His ways are high. And so that means there's going to be things that are happening, or things that he sees, or places he's going, that you're not ready for in your knowledge. You're just not ready for it. You've never thought of it, you've never considered it, you didn't know about it, whatever. And that's where faith comes in. You have to be willing to have faith. Nothing we could ever do as believers will ever make us more successful and more spiritually discerning than when we have complete, strong faith. I went through earlier how to have that sound spiritual judgment and how to be able to use that in order to grow into having spiritual discernment. But all of it rides on the foundation of faith in our hearts. It's almost like there's this careful, fragile balance between what we have to learn to understand, right? In recognizing a move of God, recognizing a word from God. That's one side of it, where we learn how to do that. We learn how to recognize God's voice. We learn how to recognize a move of God. All while having the tenacity and faith to be able to carry it out when it's time to go. That's the other side. There's a balance. You have to be able to balance between the two. Because if you go too far one way or the other, it's going to throw that balance off. So you learn how to walk with God, and you do it all based in faith. That as soon as he tells you to do something, you're ready to go. As soon as he speaks something into your heart, you accept it, and you start praying, or whatever the case may be, right? Think about how many times when you've missed the move of God, right? Or you thought you discerned something when it turned out to be not what you thought it was in the Spirit. Something was off in that balance. Something. And that's what you have to learn to understand, right? Maybe your ability to make that spiritual, that sound spiritual judgment wasn't there yet. Maybe your faith was too much or too little. But either way, you have to be able to know both. You have to be able to balance those things. And what it makes me think of is like, sometimes I look at Christian lives, and it just feels like a lot of Christians are guessing. They're just trying to throw a guess. Have you guys ever taken a test with multiple choice and you have no idea what the answer is? Well, you're probably going to guess. And there's some people that are better at guessing than others. You know, that's one thing I learned in my job. When I went to the police academy, you get tested like over and over and over and over again. And you're learning things in 6 months that some lawyers take 2 years to learn. So, I mean, you just got to learn to study and learn to take tests. And that's what you start to realize. I'm learning how to be a police officer, but I'm also learning how to study. And I'm also learning how to take a test. You start to do things like the process of elimination. It has nothing to do with the topic that you're learning. And there are some questions that they ask us where there are literally more than one right answer. And you know what they would tell us? Pick the most right answer. What are you talking about? How is that a test? What am I doing here? But that's because in law enforcement, it's not black and white. The law is black and white, but then you get into this messy situation with people, and you got to figure out how to apply it. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be easy. And so you have to start to learn how to go through this process in your mind when you're making decisions. You're learning how to okay, here's the question, here are the 4 answers. Well, I know for sure these 2, we'll throw those out. Now let's start going through these other 2 and seeing which one is most right. Okay? But some people don't get to learn that. Some people will just take a test and they'll have those 4 multiple choice answers, and they're just like, I don't know that. You know, they just guess. How often are we doing that in our walk with God? Think about what I'm talking about, spiritual discernment. God's speaking something to you. Or God's kingdom moving in a certain direction. Or Him wanting you to go in a certain direction. Or Him wanting you to stay back. Or take a step of faith. You got to know the difference, right? Think of the situations where you wonder, is this God's will for my life? Where is He calling me to? What does He want me to do? Why do I feel this thing in my life that I'm supposed to be this, but I'm nowhere near that? Whatever the case may be, don't start guessing. Don't start guessing, because that's what I'm trying to point out, is that too many Christians take this too lightly, and they start guessing instead of pressing. Press into God. When you press into God, you'll start to get your answer. It may not be instant, but you have to have the faith that He's going to come through for you. But don't start guessing. So, we have to be willing to put in the time with God to learn what it looks and feels like in the Spirit with Him in order to gain that wisdom and understanding of what spiritual discernment looks like. Don't just throw answers out there. Don't just say, yeah, this is the will of God, if you really don't know that. Because there's going to be peace and authority and confidence that come with that. If it is of God, you will have that peace. You will have that confidence. And if deep down in your heart of hearts you don't, then you should ask yourself, what are you doing? Are you guessing? Or are you actually pressing in and having faith and letting God speak to you, or letting God make it happen? If God doesn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind, then we should reside in a place of confidence and authority. That's where you should live. If I ask you your address, I don't want to hear your address. I want to hear confidence and authority because I have power, love, and a sound mind. So next time I ask for your mailing address, I want you to say power, love, and a sound mind. That's where I live, Sean. That's where I live, right there. I reside in that place. And all my decisions, all my thoughts, all my encounters in life, all my relationships with people are based through that place that I live. We have that confidence and that authority because of that. Again, that all comes from having a well-versed relationship with God, pressing in, spending time with Him, all these different things. So I want to kind of skip forward. Okay, that was almost there. So I want to give you guys an actual practical example. A practical example of what I'm talking about. And really, in all honesty, when you go through the Bible, there's a lot. When you think about what I'm talking about today, there are a lot of examples of where people had to show that they took the time to spend with God, right, to get that sound spiritual judgment, and at the same time have the faith to move, and they know or knew that they heard God speak something. So let's look to the story of Noah. Noah was given some pretty crazy instructions by God. Right? If one of y'all were to come up to me and tell me if the story of Noah had never happened, that God told you to build a boat 3 times the size of this house so that you can collect all the animals for when He floods and kills everything on earth, I'm probably going to seek out some help for you. We're gonna talk about your mental health and how you're feeling, and are you on drugs, and some other questions I'm probably going to ask you. Right? I'm making a joke of it in light of what we're talking about, but let's be real. What God called Noah to do, what He spoke to Noah, is way out there, way out there, and that's what I'm talking about. How many people in the Bible got something from God in that way that make us scratch our heads if you actually try to put yourself in their shoes? Don't just read it as like some nice little Bible story from Sunday school. No. Put yourself in that shoe, in those shoes. God just told you to build a ship. A huge ship, because He's about to kill everyone on earth. And you're the only one He found that walks in righteousness. Well, that indicates that you got the first part of what I'm talking about now. If He searched all the earth, and Noah and his family were the only ones that were honoring God, well then that means they have that first part down. They're pressing in. Every moment of every day, Noah's probably thinking about God. About where are we going today, God? What are we speaking today, God? Right? All those things that have to be in place in order to have that relationship, so that when Daddy upstairs tells you to build a boat because He's about to flood the earth, you're not like, whoa, what are you talking about? That's some crazy thought of mine, right? That's not gospel. He wouldn't call me to do that. No way. No, Noah actually had to face the situation. He had to face a situation where he was given these crazy instructions by God. So how many think he had to have spiritual discernment in order to carry all that out? Right? Just like you would perceive in the road a threat that would cause a warning inside of you to instantly go off and say, uh-oh, right? And you start to want to react to it. The same happens the other way around. In that moment, Noah had to have enough spiritual discernment to what? To reside in that peace, in that power, in that love, to know. Okay, God, that's what you called me to do. That's out there, but here we go. I better start stretching, because that's a lot of work building a boat that big. That probably took them years and years and years. And I'm sure scholars have studied that. I'm sure I learned that at some point when I went to Bible college, how long it took them to build it. It was probably forever. That's a lot of time to have doubt creep in, right? Those emotions might come in. That human reasoning and judgment might start saying, wait a minute, is that really what God said to you? Or maybe somebody else is speaking that into your ear. There's all kinds of things that can come up. But if you have spiritual discernment, if you're connected with the Heavenly Father, you have no doubts. You only have peace. And it's through that experience with God, over and over and over again, He shows Himself as faithful. And you can start standing in that firm peace that I know what God spoke to me. I don't have to guess in the multiple choice. I know what answer it is because I recognize my Father's voice. And so Noah's spirit recognized the Word of God. And Noah poured out his faith all over God's plan. All over it. Like he had a tub of water and just threw the whole thing all over it. That was his faith. He just dumped all his faith onto God's plan for his life. Hebrews 11:7 in the Passion says, faith opened Noah's heart to receive revelation. He had to have faith first in order to even receive this revelation and the warnings from God about what was coming. Even the things that had never been seen. Noah's situation was crazy. He had so much that God was speaking to him that was out of this world. No one had ever even thought of something like that. But Noah stepped out in reverent obedience to God and built an ark that would save him and his family. By his faith, the world was condemned, but Noah received God's gift of righteousness that comes by believing. So, you can look at almost any other story in the Bible where someone had to practice spiritual discernment, and they mostly will show a person who had a relationship with the Father enough to be able to know the voice and the will of God. Every single time. They would have shown that they have sound spiritual judgment, which led them to be able to have that spiritual discernment. So, my goal this morning, again, I have no 5 steps for you. My goal this morning is to inspire you. That's what I want to do more than anything, is to inspire you. So many of us are always looking for answers from God over our life. What do you have for me next? What are you speaking over me? What have you called me to do? Who do you have for my life? All these things that we want to know, that we know what God is speaking. There's so many questions, especially when you're younger, but it can happen even when you're older. You can have these things that you're facing, these challenges, these decisions, whatever, and you want to know what is the will of God for me over my life. And instead of looking like we're guessing, we have to know that the answers we are looking for are always going to be found in Him. Jesus will always be our ultimate example. And we see this entire concept I'm talking about this morning in His life. He clearly took the time to pray, to press in with God, and to keep praying, and to meditating, and pressing in until he got the word he needed, or until he saw the Holy Spirit moving. How do I know that? Because he said, I don't speak anything unless the Father tells me to speak it. I don't go anywhere unless the Father tells me to go. That tells me that for that relationship, that pressing in, that praying, he would not move until he received that spiritual discernment, where he recognized his Father's voice who says go, or speak this, or whatever. And it probably was so extreme in a good way with Jesus, where he could probably do that throughout the day because of his relationship with God, because of how connected he was. But even he still had to take time to pray. He still had to take the time to pray. So we must be willing to take that time to build that relationship with God, to press in. Jesus was so confident in his spiritual discernment. I don't remember reading one story in the Bible where he questioned himself. He was so confident in every word he spoke, in every single thing he did. He had that confidence. Why? Because he was residing in that address that we talked about. That's where he lived. He lived in power and in love and in sound mind. He could confidently go forward and do and say the things of the Father because he knew through spiritual discernment what was happening and what was being said. He abided in God in the same way that we have to abide in him, where we are completely turned in. That's what our life has to look like. If you want spiritual discernment, you want to be able to know what God is speaking over your life, where he's taking you, what he wants you to do, or if he's giving you the choice to make, and saying, here are your options, you'll be blessed either way. Pick one. Because sometimes God does that too, and we're sitting there waiting. And he's telling us to do something. You got to know what he's saying, right? We're going to find that as we press in and build our relationship with God, as we abide in him, and as we have the faith, the courage to believe and trust in God no matter what. So that should be our inspiration. Jesus showing us the way should be our inspiration to be able to get this thing called spiritual discernment. You can go buy a bunch of books, you can go listen to a bunch of sermons, and you're going to get smarter probably after all of them. And I encourage you to continue learning, and I'm not trying to knock that. All I'm saying is that none of that matters if you don't have a relationship with God first. It all has to be based on your relationship with God. We have to look to those who walked with God with such confidence and peace, and let them be our example. And Jesus was the supreme example of that. So that we can know, even if we don't have the answers in front of us, that residing with the Father is better than trying to guess of what he might have for us. Because he is good, and I know that my answer's coming. He is good, and I hear him activating me, or speaking to me to act, or whatever, right? He is good, and I can distinguish and understand what is happening in my life spiritually. And that's my message this morning. I encourage you guys to press in, to be willing to have faith, and do this for the long haul, so that as you build your relationship with God, and you start to hear things in your spirit, that you can know that it's God, and then have the faith to be able to carry it out, no matter what he's calling you to, no matter where he's speaking to you to go, or to do, or whatever. And sometimes God has some doozies, where he'll tell us to do stuff, or he'll say stuff to us that is just way out. But it's because he sees the end from the beginning. He knows things that we'll never know. And so we have to trust. We have to trust and believe in him. So, Father, I just thank you so much this morning for this message. I pray that you would strengthen each one of us to press in more, to be willing to be completely turned into you and abide in you, to take our residence in that place of peace, God, and power, and love, and sound mind, Father, where we hear your voice, we can be confident to know. Just like perceiving something in the natural, we can discern through that spirit man when it's you talking, and we can discern when it's not you talking in the spirit. We can know when you're calling us to go somewhere or do something, or when you're calling us not to, and not have to guess or walk in confusion or wonder, is this what God has for me? We can know that from this relationship we have with you and through our faith. I thank you, and I give you all the honor and the glory in the mighty name of Jesus.